Marshall Monday, University of Warwick this week. We're really pleased to welcome the University of Warwick to our session, and I hope you're going to have a really exciting time learning about this great university. I'm not going to say much because you don't want to hear from me, so I'm going to pass over to Sarah, who will tell you all about the University of Warwick.
Oh, thanks so much, Mary, and thanks to everybody for turning up today to hear from us. I'm just going to start sharing my screen now to hopefully bring up a little bit of an introduction of what we'll be looking at today. I'm Warwick's representative for students and advisors in the US, so I'm always available after today's session for any information or any questions that you might have as well. But today I'll be kicking off by providing a brief introduction to the university. I'll then be passing over to my colleague Naomi, who is going to give us an excellent taster session to highlight our interdisciplinary approach to teaching and learning at Warwick. Naomi will then be handing over to two of our students from the US, Elena and Jane, and we will then all be available for questions and answers at the end of the session as well. This will be an interactive session during Naomi's session, so please do get involved if you'd like to know a little bit more. So welcome to Warwick. We wish that we could invite you to Warwick in person, but in place of that, we have some information available for you today. Warwick is essentially just under 60 years old, but we're consistently ranked in the top 10 universities in the UK and the top 100 universities worldwide. So essentially, we've come a really long way in a really short space of time. We're a very, very welcoming campus community that is home to about 27,000 students in total and one cat. His name is Rolf. He has a Twitter account. You can follow him. We heartily recommend that you do. He's like a little personality on our campus. In terms of location, we are right in the heart of England. So we are a suburban campus located just outside of Coventry city centre, with excellent transport connections around the UK and also close to Birmingham International Airport, which offers cheap flights over to Europe and around about, which is fantastic. Coventry is a really convenient city. It's great for shopping, great for music, great for sports. Also nearby in the local area, we have beautiful historical towns like Leamington Spa, Kenilworth, which is home to, I think, the most haunted castle in England. It also has great fireworks display for fireworks night on November the 5th. Also close to Warwick Castle, Stratford-upon-Avon, and for anyone that wants a big city experience and bright lights, we've got Birmingham on the doorstep as well. In terms of our academic offering, we have three main faculties: arts, science, engineering and medicine, and social sciences. So our disciplinary excellence is central to what we have to offer, but very importantly, we have a cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary approach as well. Naomi will be a great person to give an example of this, and she's also taught in the US, so she'll be able to hopefully highlight a few differences in that approach for you as well. In terms of rankings, I'm not going to throw rankings and ref scores at you because all of that is available to look at online, but we're good. And in terms of that interdisciplinary approach coming together, our Global Research Priorities programme really highlights this, with our researchers working across academic disciplines to tackle truly international challenges. And we run some very unique interdisciplinary programs which are useful to highlight as well. So these range across arts, social sciences and sciences as well. As an example, last year's Fulbright Award winner came and studied on our MA Philosophy in the Arts. Also, the current Fulbright winner coming in next year will be studying on the MSc Humanitarian Engineering. And Jane is available today, our current Fulbright student, to answer questions about applying to Fulbright for Warwick as well. In terms of the campus, I said we had about 27,000 students in total. Of those, around 10,000 are grad school students, so it's an incredibly large grad school community. And it's very important to highlight how international Warwick is. About 39% of our students come from outside the UK. So it's something that really, really does affect and is something where students can really benefit from that truly international experience. On the campus, we have the Piazza, which is like the social hub. The Oculus is our state-of-the-art teaching and learning facilities. The library is open 24/7 during term time. Warwick Arts Centre is one of the largest multi-platform arts venues outside of London. And we have great sports facilities and the Students' Union. And the Students' Union is very important to highlight because the type of student that is going to enjoy their time at Warwick is one who is intellectually curious, but who is also interested in kind of making things happen, giving back and trying out and exploring new things. So the Students' Union, they run over 300 different clubs and societies. So there's a lot to get involved in there. And importantly, we have accommodation on campus as well. For the postgraduate students, we have a postgraduate community engagement team. They run the postgraduate hub, which helps to bring our community together. And also, they also run the Wolfson Research Exchange as well, which also brings researchers together and gives them independent and group study spaces, as well as lockers. So for students who are living off campus, they get to store their possessions there. The community engagement team also run lots of different events, and these are a fantastic way to bring people together because sometimes master's study and PhD study can be very intense. It can be isolating. And so therefore this community of different events that run throughout vacation help to try and bridge that. Personally, my favourite event would have been the Research Harambe, in which our students were encouraged to bake their own research last year, a bit like Bake Off, to help represent their thesis through that. In terms of accommodation, all of our housing on campus is self-catered, so all students will have access to a kitchen, and there's a really wide range of different accommodation options. The prices vary going from about £77 a week up to about £207 per week. So there's a big spread there, and that reflects the difference in facilities. We also now have private studios available for the first time this year as well. And what's another popular option is off-campus accommodation. So we're really well linked by public transport to get around. And Elena and Jane, who are joining us today, both live in off-campus accommodation and would be able to share insights on that if people have questions. If you'd like to find out more about student experience at Warwick, we have a couple of great different ways to do that. So coming up in July, we have 2 virtual open weeks. Now, these are aimed at high school students looking to study undergraduate programs, so that in terms of the content and what the faculty will be covering, it's not exactly the same as what an applicant to Fulbright or Marshall would be looking at. But in terms of the 360-degree tour and getting a feel for the vibe of the campus, there'd be a great way to learn more. And also I offer 25-minute chats on a regular basis by Skype, WhatsApp, Microsoft Teams. It's all informal and it's just a chance to learn more. So if you're interested, you can sign up here. That said, we've got a lot to get through today, so I will now pass over to my colleague Naomi, who's going to offer a taster session that she delivers for her students.
Thanks very much, Sarah. So just before I begin the teaching demonstration kind of taster session topical material, I'm just going to say a very couple of brief words about my department and something about my background that might help you to see what's exciting about Warwick. So I'm in the Center for Interdisciplinary Methodologies, which is quite a mouthful, so it gets shortened to SIM. And we are a bunch of scholars from multiple disciplinary backgrounds. In the department, we teach 3 taught postgraduates, so 3 master's degrees, an MA in Digital Media and Culture, an MSc in Big Data and Digital Futures, and another MSc in Urban Analytics and Visualization. So it's quite a broad range of taught postgrad degrees, but they all have the sort of contemporary issues focus, some of the big, most pressing challenges that we're facing today in terms of things like data, online culture, and what is happening in sort of changes in urban regeneration and so on. So these themes are very prominent. We are a sort of digital global challenges department, if you like, something a little bit like that. And we also have a PhD program in interdisciplinary studies, which I think is something that is really quite special, to have this sort of focus on interdisciplinary and methodological work at both the MA and PhD level. We're a relatively small department, but really quite diverse in our disciplinary backgrounds and interests. Myself, I have a background in the humanities, in philosophy and in music, and specifically in sound studies. So I taught for 6 years. My first sort of main job was in the US at the University of Pennsylvania, where I taught in music and in comparative literature, both at undergrad and in the PhD programs. But I think one of the main reasons I left and came to Warwick was precisely to pursue more interdisciplinary teaching and research. At Penn, what I found was that I was able to do co-teaching with other people in other departments, but it was often sponsored as an exception by some kind of grant program, such as the Mellon Foundation, that I'm very grateful for, that sponsored a number of new courses when I was there. But at Warwick, one of the wonderful things is there's this investment in cross-faculty and interdisciplinary programs. So they happen not as an exception, not as something where staff are having to make exceptions or devote extra elements of their time outside their normal teaching load, but it's a dedicated department there, and they're also dedicated cross-faculty programs as well. So that was what was really exciting for me, because as you'll get a sense from this module, it really doesn't fit into just one topic at all. And the other module that I teach touches on questions in environmental humanities as well, and climate change, as well as kind of sound listening methodologies. So it really doesn't fit easily. It would probably get taught in Comp Lit or English in most American universities. But here we really can have that sort of dedicated interdisciplinary approach. So I'm now going to share my screen and move into giving you a little bit of a taster of what we might do in a session of this module. So I'm going to assume that this works, and if it doesn't, someone shout at me, but you should now, I hope, all be able to see my screen. So what is media activism, and why would we study this in a module? Well, essentially it's the work of moving political organizing and campaigning onto digital platforms, and specifically the kind of, not mass media, but digital media is the focus of this module. And we're looking at how activism then becomes much more dynamic, is technologically mediated, but also how it continues to be structured by the prevailing logic of capital, which has largely changed to adapt to kind of a post-Fordist, post-industrial model to one that's more of a cognitive knowledge economy that engages more with big tech, greater reliance on digital technologies and platforms, that sort of thing. So we look at activism, political organizing in this broad environment of technological aspects, but also political economic shaping of what is possible. And it encompasses lots of different kind of things, from sort of digital versions of quite conventional political organizing and campaigning, through to what we call tactical media or performance approaches, sort of like disruptive hacking, performances online, theatrical endeavors and spectacles, through to more kind of mainstream hacking to disseminate information, to cause leaks and so on. And then things like art and design projects that are specifically designed for digital media, to campaign for certain aspects. And then the sort of big stories of recent politics that we might call the media squares or Twitter revolutions, things like the Occupy movement, the Arab Spring, and offshoots from these kinds of things. And we look at how digital media, what role digital and social media play in those political events. And then also towards the end of the module, we look at the specific role of digital technologies for political parties and democratic institutions, looking at things like climate change, citizens' juries, but also then the use of almost exclusively digital parties springing up in Europe in recent years with more populism on the ground. But this coming year, we're going to be looking, one of the sessions will look specifically about how the pandemic has been affecting activism. And I thought it would be useful to give you a taste of what we might discuss in that, as it's so topical. And so essentially, we've seen public measures have drastically curtailed the right to assemble, and that had a massive impact, at least initially, at the beginning of the pandemic. We'll look at how that changed. But this meant that there were limited opportunities for conventional collective action in public spaces. And so we saw this proliferation of online forms of organizing, including local mutual aid groups, but also workplace and community organizing, now all moving onto online digital platforms, bringing people across the country together who would not normally have met in person. We also saw various misinformation wars going on around what was safe, whether people should wear masks, these kinds of things. But we've also seen big tech stepping in. We're on Zoom today. Most of us, our lives would not have continued without Silicon Valley shaping them. And this is also showing, we're going to be seeing contact tracing apps dominated by the big tech giants. Surveillance is becoming an increasing concern at this time as well, especially for activists. And at the very beginning of what in the UK we were calling the lockdown, not very comfortable with that carceral terminology, but the beginning of like stringent public health measures meant that street protests were very rare. There were some in Greece, for instance, but quite rare. And I looked like I was going to a protest. I normally do a lot of my field work in protests, but to go to the supermarket, I looked like I was in my protest get-up, everything minus goggles for the tear gas, but pretty much everything else I would normally wear, all wrapped up for a protest, and my mouth all covered and so forth. But of course, as we all know, this massively changed with the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. So we'll look at briefly what happened with mutual aid, how it was quite different to more top-down organizing structures. So here in the UK, the wonderful, much-loved National Health Service organized a volunteer responder service. This was government-backed, very much top-down. But by comparison with that, we've seen loads of endeavors, as in the US, of people responding to the needs of their local communities in ways that are very hyper-local and agile, dependent on WhatsApp groups and online coordination, Facebook groups, and so forth. Often these were charitable in orientation, very spontaneous, very little organizing or the kind of traditional capacity building we might see in longer-term organizing. They often had to deal with the fact that many of the communities they were looking to help were not familiar with, or maybe didn't have access to digital platforms, particularly elderly people. And we've seen different variations of this all around the globe. In China, for instance, where a number of our students at SEM come from, one of their digital platforms, Sina Weibo, became a kind of medical helpline default place for people to actually get serious medical advice. And then we've also seen, and I've been very busy in this, loads of trade union and community unions like tenants organizations zooming away in terms of organizing now much more nationally coordinated campaigns, often around health and safety. We've seen large recruitment surges for unions. We've seen big victories for unions, especially for teachers, on health and safety issues in the UK. But in the US, also to some extent in the UK, we've seen big wildcat strikes, McDonald's, KFC, Amazon warehouse workers, and all of this was coordinated largely through digital platforms and promoted that way, and has been quite effective. But of course, everything kind of changed when a Black man, George Floyd, was murdered in Minneapolis by police, and we saw a sudden return of street activism. People started weighing up the risks of racial discrimination and marginalization against the health risks of the pandemic. And a lot of people wearing masks, often, especially strictly in the US compared with here, I think, took to the streets. And what we suddenly saw was a lot of people who maybe couldn't come in the streets having to follow this kind of activism through the media, through this sort of spectacle, watching on Instagram or Facebook live streaming, and finding ways to perform their own allyship on social media. So really like a lot of changes for how people were engaging with street actions. And so this is something that's quite interesting that we would kind of look at in detail in this session. So Black Lives Matter, moving around the globe, really taking off around the globe, has been one effect of this. And that transmission has been very dependent on social media for its transmission. It's allowed solidarities to emerge that weren't necessarily as visible before. I do a lot of my own fieldwork in Paris and have for some time been involved in anti-racist and anti-fascist organizing there, researching with a group of people called Justice pour Adama, or La Committee pour Adama, which is a young Black man who was killed by police. And very few people had made the connection between this and what was happening in the States for a long time now. Assa Traore, the sister of the young man who was killed, she's doing New York Times interviews. She's in the Washington Post because of what has happened recently and because of the sort of mediatized nature of these protests now. She's gaining visibility and a global connection between these kinds of activism that we haven't seen before. Other things that have taken place, I'm sure you all saw Blackout Tuesday, people using black squares on their Instagram. We also saw designers, groups such as Blacks Who Design or Drawing While Black, using Instagram as a platform for campaigning and for other activism. But then we also saw the flip side of this was a lot of corporate brands getting on the bandwagon, joining in, expressing their anti-racist solidarity, perhaps even while continuing with employment practices that don't fit with that agenda. So there's some debate about what the quality of online or social media activism can be and how it's open to certain forms of co-option. But I think it's also very timely. So the module will enable us to look at general historical trends since the birth of the internet, but also very specific things that are going on in this area right now and how they're changing. So the module is often involving very recent materials every week, looking at new news reports and so on, and engaging with those. But also at the core of the module is a campaign design project, which the students really love. They get to design in small groups their own campaign around an issue that they choose. Elena might speak to this a little bit later. She did a really excellent campaign with her group, which I'm sure she can tell you about. I won't spoil that. But that is the core of the module, and you have to think about, obviously you don't run the whole campaign, there wouldn't be time to do that, but you plan the campaign and work out what elements you would need to work at, who you would need to work with, who your audience is, what the key demands might be for the campaign, and how best to use digital and social media as well as live face-to-face campaigning to make it work. So what I thought would be fun is that we were going to have little short breakouts, kind of 8 to 10 minutes. I'm not sure how we're doing for time, but something along those lines. And we're going to discuss in a group briefly, how you might go about doing this kind of campaign design project. And because we're short on time, rather than let you pick a topic, I thought I'd just set one that's very topical, which would be about statues being toppled, which I'm sure you're all aware of in the news. It's happening here, it's happening in the US, about people bringing down the statues of historical figures known perhaps for their involvement in the slave trade or other forms of racialized oppression. And so the question really I'm going to put to you is, how would you design a media activism campaign to remove monuments to historical oppressors, and how you would go about doing that? With the following pointers. I'm going to post those pointers now. I'm going to stop my screen share and post those pointers in the chat for everybody. and we are then going to be assigned into breakout rooms facilitated by my handy helpers, my team here, who will hopefully, yeah, wave, go ahead team, thank you very much. And those facilitators are going to try and make sure that everyone gets a chance to speak. We're going to ask you to use the raise hand function in the chat. Sorry, not in the chat, it's in the participants tab on Zoom. If you tap on that, then you should see a raise hand function. But do please post in the chat if you've got problems using the raise hand function, but we're going to try and use that. I'm also going to ask each group to have a volunteer who will feedback very briefly after the breakout sessions, just for a minute, just to tell us what you discussed, key points of your conversation. So I think without much further ado, I'm going to suggest we go into our breakouts. It looks like we're ready. I'm seeing nodding. And I will see you all back again in about 10 minutes.
All right, y'all should be receiving an invitation to join a breakout room, and a handful of you will stay here in this main room with Naomi. So bear with us for a moment. All right, and then Mary and Naomi, we have a smaller group of about 6, I believe, who are staying in this main room.
No problem. I think quite a few, not everyone I can see. If you feel willing and are happy to share your video, it'd be lovely to see your faces as well. I understand if you don't want to, but it would be lovely. And if people will maybe just very quickly, I'm just going to suggest we go around the room and just say very briefly who you are. I think that would be nice for everyone. And so maybe we can just start with first person I can see on the video on my screen, Victoria.
Hi, I'm Victoria Hightower. I'm an associate professor of history, and I am the assistant director of nationally competitive scholarships at the University of North Georgia in, obviously, Georgia.
Thank you very much. Thatcher.
Hello, I'm Thatcher Hart. I'm a student at the University of North Florida in the US, and I'm aspiring and looking at grad programs.
Wonderful, nice to meet you. Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan Albrecht. I am the fellowship advisor at Wabash College, a small school in Indiana.
Wonderful, thank you. Corey, are you there? Do you want to introduce yourself? I'm going to just, not sure if you're there. I'm going to move on, but we'll come back. Ah, sorry, I'm seeing a message now. Yes, that's absolutely fine. No problem. Dave, do you want to introduce yourself? Maybe same thing. And LaShawn? Okay, I think we might have some people just listening, which is absolutely fine. Maybe I'm happy to have answer some other questions in here as well. If people have them, we'll have them in Q&A, but I thought it would be interesting to talk about, do a little bit of the breakout, and maybe we can also discuss how that might, whether we think that would be interesting to students, this kind of interdisciplinary approach. But it would be interesting to hear from anyone if you've got specific questions about the module, or if you have specific things you'd like to say about this campaign design project.
And just to say, this is the group that is being recorded. So just so you're aware, this is the group that's being recorded.
Thanks for the heads up, Mary. I will keep my Liverpool shout outs to a minimum then, right? So
yeah.
So Naomi, you're interested in just any kind of question about this kind of the module itself?
I think given we're quite a small group and who is here, to make use of this time most usefully, if you want to use it that way, we can also talk about the specific campaign design project too. But
I guess I was interested mostly in how one might promote this approach to students who are looking at maybe a Marshall Scholarship or a Fulbright, or just studying abroad in general. How would you tout its advantages, I think?
I mean, I think in some ways it partly depends on the experience. I mean, I think you can tie it in to thinking about the kind of conventional liberal arts approach in some institution, you know, that is promoted in various ways to less or greater extents in US institutions. I think it is well suited. This kind of approach is well suited to a continuation of that at a more advanced level. I think also it potentially fills a sort of gap, I think, for those who get to the end of their undergraduate degree, and of course they won't have been as specialized as UK undergraduates by nature, you know, even with the different kinds of programs on offer in the US, they are still all more diverse than we have in the UK. And to say that this is a stepping stone or a transition for people thinking maybe of a PhD program or of a career that is less disciplinary focused, that this is a very nice program, each of the 3 degrees in a way for bringing together those issues and helping people to find that path where they don't want necessarily a very specialized academic or industry future, but maybe they want a little bit more focus than they've had in their undergraduate degree. I think it's especially a good program for people who've been interested in things in the divide, like that are across the divides in terms of sciences, social sciences, and arts and humanities. Like I had students like that at Penn who took music courses, right? But it wasn't their major, but we had many of them in there or in Complet with a lot of interest, but who said, oh, I don't really want to kind of give this up. I like this part of my life, but also I want to be a data scientist or something. And I think SIM is wonderful for having that kind of critical dynamic, but also is already steering you towards thinking about certain kind of careers, maybe in policy making and data analysis, careers that are really on the rise right now, but it doesn't give up on that humanistic, cultural, critical, theoretical approach that more specialist programs would. And then conversely, for people with a kind of more arts and humanities leaning, I think it's a nice way to explore whether you might do something that is around these kind of global challenge sort of issues, whether that might be a career path for you, but while still having the kind of approaches to learning and studying and thinking that you might be more familiar with. It's also, you know, for people looking at scholarships, like the quality of academic work that goes on in SIM is really outstanding. You know, I have worked at Cambridge and at Penn, so I have quite experience of working with, you know, some of the most intelligent and brightest students around the world. And I have to say that SIM attracts people with these minds that can go across multiple areas, very agile thinkers, and really, you know, it's a wonderful intellectual environment to be in. I don't know if other people have any other questions or things they would like to talk about.
If I
Yeah, jump in.
Sorry.
Oh, it's okay. I think we're a small number, so I can manage.
Wait, I know it's in here.
No, the raised hands was for like 20 people, so it's fine.
But no, my question. Ooh, and my cat. Sorry, my cat just decided to edit me. But my question is about the tech expectations for students, right? I mean, certainly for the big data and digital future module, but and analytics and visualization, you know, how do the students, I guess, acquire those skills, and what are the expectations for their knowledge? Do they need to have programming or cyber experience or anything like that, or how does that work?
No, they don't. There are not high thresholds. Like they don't need to have been a computer science major or like have majored in mathematics or something like that to have either of those skills. The core modules in the big data degree are taught together with PACE, political and science and international studies, taught by, you know, people with specialisms in statistics and data analytics. some of the classes for big data, such as in machine learning, do have students from computer science in the room. So people with mixed degrees of experience, but there are a lot of labs, a lot of individual support. I think I've seen students with both. We have students in our digital media program who come in with very little, programming or next to no programming experience, but they will take one of these modules alongside our big data students and computer science students. And with that support, we have lots of specialist workshops like R workshops, Python workshops on top of the core modules. So it's not intended for people simply with one kind of background. So that is, it's fairly open. And likewise in my own classes, I have a mixture. I mean, I'm also like supervising for the dissertation, someone who is doing a coding project, who cannot code, but it's on colonialism, on decolonialism. So that's why and we're sort of set up, he's getting alternative advice from our academic technologists on the coding side, and I'm advising on the decolonialism. Thatcher, do you have any questions for me?
I think I'm just kind of gathering the information. I think it's been a lot of great information so far, and I'm just kind of absorbing all of it right now. So I don't really have any questions, no.
It's probably a lot to take in.
A little bit, but
I remember being in your place, and it's really overwhelming. I was looking to move to the States to study, and that suddenly this was a whole new horizon, and it was yeah, very, very difficult to take it all in. But I do want to say, if you want to get in touch, I'm going to put, when everyone joins us, I'm going to put my contact details in the chat as well, if anyone has any further questions for me.
Great, thank you.
Are we all now coming back? Did I see a message?
Whenever you give me the word, I'll close the rooms and send them back. But Naomi, I did have a question about social media as a tool for activism, because people talk about these positive feedback loops and the way that they're coded so that you're just receiving information that you want to see, sort of like a mirror reflecting back online. And I wonder what the advantages and disadvantages of that are in your eyes through the lens of social activism.
Yeah, I think that, there are lots of arguments around bubbles and polarization, and who gets to exploit changes in algorithms more effectively. For instance, the big example I can think of is that the Labour Party was very successful in the UK in 2017 in navigating Facebook's algorithms and had huge organic reach on the platform. And in 2019, I think they got complacent, didn't invest in tackling the algorithmic changes, but their opponents did, and very successfully, headed up and advised by someone who has a great passion for data analytics. So I think you have to be aware of the limitations as well as the potential of platforms when you're organizing. And there are definitely pros and cons, and it's definitely not all techno-utopianism, but also isn't all techno-pessimism either. I think there's, I think the pandemic is showing what can be done, especially around workplace organizing, which has been something quite unexpected, but unions have really profited, oddly enough, from Zoom, and ironically. Yeah.
Thank you. And would you suggest closing the breakout rooms and inviting everyone back?
Yes, I can see some people are coming back. I'm going to post my details to the chat, and then I'll say one final word when everyone's here and pass on to Elena.
Sounds good. So participants have about 40 more seconds to return to the main room before the breakout rooms close.
No problem. People who've just come back, welcome back. Oh, I forgot. Of course, I'm not passing straight on to Elena. I'm asking for feedback. Sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself in my plan. This is the bit where I need to be a stand-up comic, and I'm not. but just to direct you, I'll say this again, but I've just put into the chat my email address, also my Twitter handle, as I do discover young people often now send their inquiries via Twitter to me. So that's also, you're very welcome to contact me on there or on my email. And I think, are most people back? I think so. So maybe the people who are volunteers, I'm just going to say, if they can make themselves known. I'm not sure how to do the order perfectly. I can see Christina. Let's start with you and Luan, and then I'll work out who's next. Christina, can you just tell us briefly what you were discussing?
So in our breakout group, we tended to have a number of people who are based in the South, from Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia. And so the concept of Confederate statues is very real. Most county seats in our regions tend to have a Confederate statue. And while ideally the audience for this campaign would be as broad as possible, we do see that the kind of bubbles form, and really the challenge of getting each side, not just two sides, but seeing how those symbols, the statues, are viewed by people from different lenses. And we did think that the social media was a good way to organize groups who were trying to find people who shared an opinion of the issue in order to protest or something, but it was much more difficult to have a productive conversation. And then Sarah brought up in the UK that you can petition Parliament to discuss a topic with so many people signing the petition. And we really didn't think we had something like that in the US per se, maybe at a local level, but not at the national level. Our lobbyists are too powerful. So
yeah, that makes sense.
Anyone else in my group want to comment on a topic that we shared? We didn't follow all of your questions.
That's okay. That normally happens in class too. But that's the idea. They're a starting point. Wonderful. Who was your facilitator, Christina?
Sarah.
Sarah. Okay, perfect. Just so I'm keeping track of groups. Thank you very much. So, Luan, were you the feedback person?
Yes, me together with Kelly Medley. We, of course, began the response to the question with, you have to have a really good hashtag in order to organize social media. So I just lost my questions. Okay. So designing a good hashtag, and then how to exploit social media, of course, across all platforms, but then thinking about the message that you're sending, that education was a key component of the message that you want to have out there. Talking a little bit about how the historical context of the statue that's being addressed is not always evident to the participants, particularly more recent events. And so being mindful across various platforms and depending on the platform, and various audiences, that having a component that really educates about the historical context is important. And then I'll let Kelly take over the rest of the response.
Sure. I think something that probably came up as we started to drill down further into the questions was also sort of maybe, your age versus, sort of your lived experiences. So whether that was certainly what we see as a more watered down teaching of US history, even more and more right now, for really younger populations versus like, currently my age range and those of, my friends and those who I socialize with are typically people who are, you know, have families or are still at points in their careers where, you know, they're newer or trying to move up in certain ways. There's, you know, the time is, you know, maybe a bit more of a commodity than it was at other points, right? And so age and sort of where your life experiences are may affect one, what platform you potentially use and who you socialize with, who you choose to socialize with on those certain platforms, but then also what actions you can kind of take on those platforms. So I mentioned, you know, that on my personal Instagram account right now that I use, the link in my bio, you know, if you click on it, it generates an automated email to people, officials in Louisville, Kentucky, related to, you know, demands for the death of Breonna Taylor. And so, you know, I repost every 24 hours or so, like, hey, you can just go to my, you know, link on there and click on that and do these 2 things. And it takes less than a minute. And, you know, that is an important activist work that you can do because I feel that that is something I'm capable of sharing, you know, and that's something that, again, those people that I socialize with on that particular platform would be interested in doing that. So, you know, it just sort of was an example that also corresponded to age and experiences and work, you know, you feel like you may be able to do it at the current time and place you're in.
Yeah, it's important it can be a sort of sustainable amount of activity that you can do it as well, isn't it? Suited to the rest of your life. Yeah, absolutely. Who was the feedback person in your group, Elena?
That was me.
Oh, that was your group. Sorry.
Yeah.
And in Jane's group.
It'd be Jane. Other Jane. So we actually had a discussion about age too, and the kinds of messages that are going to be in terms of an audience, but also the type of technology that gets used is kind of an important consideration depending on age group. We also talked an awful lot about, you know, being as specific as possible. So what monuments are we, you know, addressing? You know, are there particular statues, are there particular histories associated with it? Where is it located? So who owns it is a big consideration, because we had a discussion about a campus in Virginia that has a statue of an unknown Confederate soldier at the entrance of the university, but the university doesn't own the space upon which the statue is located. So that, you know, provides some layers of complexity, and, you know, the response of the university, you know, who gets a lot of blame for having the statue there. How do they go about putting that into context and using that as a teachable moment? Also make sure you have the right tools. You know, it's one thing to want to bring a statue down, but, you know, understand that they sometimes can be have been put in place for permanent, and so without the right tools, you're not going to bring it down. And then I guess that maybe kind of summarizes it. Just kind of this focus on specificity was something we talked an awful lot about, considering also the ideological basis of your audience, like who's the audience you want to convince. You know, like-minded folks, obviously it's preaching to the choir, but can you get this message across to people who don't necessarily agree or think the way you think?
Yeah, that's always a big thing in any kind of campaigning, but I think one that has become more acute with things moving onto social media platforms, which is the extent to which the campaign is about the third-party audience rather than either of the parties, you know, the campaigners or the people that you're kind of targeting. Like, how much are you playing to the rest of the world on a stage? And that's become a lot more acute, I think, in a much more mass, you know, even more globalized media age than mass media was. And it's, as you say, very specific with the kind of strategies you might find that you could coalesce more broad support around the removal of a particular statue and less around you know, a certain category of statues in general, which might be more problematic. So yeah, it's some of it's old organizing problems and some of it is specifically new ones. Thank you. And who was the final person? Go ahead.
I know. I mean, so that it was my group. I'm going to volunteer on behalf of them. So in addition to everything else that was discussed, really, I mean, I'm obviously making use of the digital platforms and so on. We also discussed about involving the policymakers within this whole process, and obviously there's different ways of going about it. You know, like what happened in Bristol, where people just tore down the statue. And you know that's the way that they wanted to make a stance, but is there a way of doing it so that is done, I suppose, in the right way, where you involve the policymakers, you create that awareness about that historical oppressor. Some people might not know what they've done, who he or she was, but maybe in this way you can sort of raise that awareness. And someone suggested about maybe putting some QR codes on the statues, explaining who the person was, what they did, and so on, having a vote around it perhaps. But again, it was, I suppose that's the main thing we wanted to add.
Yeah, that's really useful. I love the QR code idea, because often
I think it was Michael. Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, often so little information about it. People, you know, the statues occupy these spaces, but not everyone is aware of the history. And a lot of this is about learning and how to make it more educational. And you make a good point about policymakers. It's always a big question. It's been quite interesting what happened in Bristol. Obviously, this happened without the backing of policymakers. There was a long-standing campaign to get councillors involved, and you know, various political machinations meant that didn't happen. But what is interesting is in the wake of that, very much like street direct action, other councils have voluntarily started to act on that, or to put in motion steps towards removing similar statues. So there's often a link between different forms of action as well, and how you can get buy-in from policymakers at different stages. But it's all very strategic, very specific, as Jane said. So it's very interesting, but I'm conscious things have gone on longer than we were meant to have done, and that I should be handing over promptly to Elena. I'll just remind you, my contact details are in the chat if you want to get in touch with me. I'll also, if there are questions for me specifically, there's one in the chat. I'll answer those in the Q&A. But we had an amazing student in my media activism class, and she's going to introduce herself and say a little bit about herself now.
Right. Hi everyone, my name is Elena, if you couldn't already tell. I'm currently a master's student doing big data and digital futures in the same department as Naomi in SIM. And at the moment I'm doing my dissertation, and that's basically on, it's using, analyzing social media discourse to see if social media movements have work as an effective form of education. And it's quite interdisciplinary in the way that it does the research. So a lot of it is very heavily humanities and social sciences work, because I've got to look at the literature and sort of do that sort of theoretical framework for it, for the analysis. But then on the analysis side, I am building a model that can detect whether or not tweets are sexist or not sexist, and that's because I do use a large amount of Twitter data for that. And then I found Warwick, the University of Warwick. I found it, well, actually, it was a bit of a funny story. I was moving down here anyways, and there was, I looked at the universities down here, and I found that, I found the University of Warwick, and I found that it had a very good academic reputation. And I did my undergraduate degree. It was an arts degree. It was a Bachelor of Arts, and what I wanted to do was a very sciencey degree. And all of the programs I applied to were quite technical, and they didn't want an arts student on it. But there was a program at work that I found, and it was absolutely everything I wanted to do. It combined my humanities background with a more technical role that I wanted. And so that's why I chose Warwick, because it was a really good university, and it had exactly the program that I wanted. And at the moment I am on the postgraduate executive committee for Warwick, and that's basically just I help facilitate postgraduate life for yeah, all of the postgrads at Warwick. And I suppose in terms of my of all the non-academic stuff that I do at Warwick, I've created a very unofficial but very official to us kind of society. We call it the Big Data Society, and we hold weekly socials to kind of get to know everyone and also expand our connect the departments together. And so I did my undergraduate degree in a university in the Northeast. I completed high school in the States, in Northern Virginia, and then I moved to the UK and I did my undergraduate degree in the Northeast. And when I moved to the UK, there was a bit of a cultural difference. It was a bit of a culture shock getting used to UK life. I think, for the most part, I found the humor very different. But it was quite good to expose myself to finding out, another culture. And it was also very easy. I mean, the two nations, America and the UK, they both speak English, but it's so funny how different they can be. But yeah, I mean, it's basically my background and what I'm doing now. Yeah, and if Jane wants to come on and share hers.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Jane. I am the Fulbright Scholar, like Sarah said, for this year, and I'm doing an MSc by research in biomedical engineering, which essentially means I'm doing a 12-month independent research project with Professor Joanna Collingwood, my supervisor in the engineering department. And just sort of a brief overview of what I'm doing. I'm looking at the role of transition metals like copper and iron in neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and sort of developing new technology to sort of image and characterize those things. It's about as broad as I can be. Yeah, so essentially, just to dive into why I chose Warwick, it was very much for the research, and when I was applying, that's actually how I heard about it in the first place. I just knew of Joanna's work sort of through the literature, and I was lucky that she was very receptive to me when I reached out and told her I wanted to apply for Fulbright and join her lab in that way. And that was actually one of the most helpful parts of the application process, looking back, was that I had the opportunity to talk to Joanna, and she introduced me to a lot of her students as well. And then I had met Sarah through my own fellowship advisor at my university. So basically, when I was applying, one of the most helpful things that I had was I was able to actually talk to people on campus, which both sort of helped me in terms of it motivated me more to want to go there and actually, meet all of these people and join the community. But then it also gave me a lot of really good on the ground information to sort of include in my application. So that was the one thing I think that helped me the most. Yeah, and then sort of going beyond that of why I chose Warwick, like I said, it had a lot to do with the research itself. It had a lot to do with the degree. That was actually super confusing at first, because apparently there are three types, at least three, there might be more types of master's degrees that I could have gotten, and I had no idea what the difference was between them. I think it was like MSc by research, MRes, MPhil, none of those words meant anything to me. But that was actually, again, talking to people at work, Joanna helped me sort of narrow down which one fit mine. And then basically what drew me to the MSc by research was that it would be very research intensive, which is something that I wanted. I didn't really want to do another year of taught courses, so I don't do any of that, and I can just focus on my project, which I found really great because I didn't find any similar programs in the US. I don't think they're quite as common over there. So I really appreciated that opportunity. So the project itself was good. And then also, just to repeat this again, but I really was drawn to this sort of interdisciplinarity. So I'm not involved in any of the, I guess, sort of like explicitly interdisciplinary programs. Like I'm just in the engineering school, but the sort of, I guess, atmosphere of interdisciplinarity is very present. I sort of bop around between the chemistry department, engineering, physics, life sciences, and there aren't really barriers to me. In fact, it's like really encouraged to go and sort of talk with as many fields as possible, which I thought was really compelling. So it was a mix of that. And then also what I liked was that the people I talked to seemed to share a lot of my values, and it was sort of reflected in the institution. Like my supervisor was really involved in sort of gender parity in the sciences. mental health resources and those sorts of things. So it was good to come to a place where it seemed like the things that were important to me was also important to the institution. So that was good. Gosh, this is going longer than I thought. Okay, and then briefly, student life outside academics. There are a lot of great societies that I've been a part of. Like I mentioned, the sort of gender activism and the mental health things have both been organizations that I can be a part of. And then also on the fun side, there's a lot of good social societies, and it's a great opportunity to sort of travel all around England as well, which I've been doing since I could only be there for a year. Turns out, I mean, less than that, but at the time I thought only a year. But it was actually, Coventry's a great place to sort of, it's a good jumping off point to go to a lot of places in England, which I had a lot of fun with. So yeah, that's it.
Excellent, thanks so much, Jane. And I just really echo what Jane said about reaching out to people and talking. Just last week, I had a Skype chat with a really interesting student from Loyola Marymount who's interested in one of our MA Applied Theatre programs. I've helped him to connect with the program director, a really friendly guy called Bobby Smith, who teaches on the program. And when I introduced the student to Bobby said, he's actually the second Fulbright applicant that I've been in touch with in the past 2 weeks. But we tend to find that faculty at Warwick are very friendly, very approachable, and very down to earth. So if any advisors or students ever need help identifying a program director, definitely feel free to come to me. I'll put my email address in here as well, or just sign up on one of the 25-minute Skype chats and find my details through there. And I can definitely help to facilitate that process. But that said, I'm very mindful that we've all run over. Thanks to everybody attending for their patience, and thanks to everybody from Warwick for helping out. And we do still have time while everybody has good grace to go into questions and answers. So if you do have any questions, please do type them into the text box, and we'll be really happy to help with that. And I guess the first question is going to be to Naomi, because we had a question to Naomi asking, have you done psychology or neuroscience research on music, brain, well-being and health?
So although I'm not on the science side of things, but I did do some work that was published in a journal, Music and Science, on the interface between advances in neuroscience and continental philosophy that was beginning to explore questions around neuroplasticity, the brain, and technological advancements. Also a French philosopher called Catherine Malbout. So I wrote about that and its interfaces with science. So from a sort of philosophy standpoint, I've definitely done work intersecting on that area. I'm kind of now hoping that as I'm in a department that explicitly has links to science departments, that doing more work in that area might also be possible. Something that would have been much harder, I think, at Penn. But yeah, it's definitely a fascinating area. And well-being comes up all the time, even without the harder science stuff with listening.
Excellent, thanks Naomi. And Jane, we've got some questions coming through. Jane, could you talk about your proposal for the community engagement project in your Fulbright application? Were you able to do what you proposed ultimately?
Sure, yes. So I will say, gosh, I'll try to remember exactly what I wrote at the time. I don't think I ever proposed a sort of formalized community engagement project. I had sort of multiple options, and a lot of them were dependent on the opportunities that they had at Warwick. One of the things I really liked is that it's connected to the medical school, so I did a lot in terms of planning to do hospital volunteering. And then also I think there was a society I was involved in called Mind Aware, which is about outreach to local primary schools and teaching them about mental health resources. And I was ultimately able to do both of those things, although unfortunately my hospital volunteering got cut a bit short by the pandemic. But other than that, yeah, it was really great because the website was really sort of transparent about the opportunities.
That's really useful, thanks. And I'd also add that giving back is really popular at Warwick amongst our students. And Warwick Volunteers runs a lot of different programs, and outside of that, in Coventry and in the local area, there are lots of different good organisations, and so some of them have searchable databases and links. So if anyone has any questions about different activities in Warwick, I can definitely send you those links out, and that will help to narrow down that search as well. And next question is for Elena and Jane. we didn't talk about how to find housing off campus versus on campus. Any thoughts from the students and why you chose to live off campus? If we pass that first to Elena, if she's still here.
Yeah. Okay, I decided to live off campus. It wasn't really a decision. I applied to really quite late to the university, so I couldn't apply for on-campus accommodation. But I've done off-campus accommodation since I think my second year of uni, so it was quite something I was just really used to. And there are a lot of resources that Warwick offers that talks about how to find off-campus accommodation. And I just think there's a lot more flexibility. I was told when I moved here that Leamington was a very big student population sort of town. So I decided to live in Leamington, as it was, I wanted a bit of distance from, from universities, just so that I could kind of enjoy my personal student life a little bit more. Yeah, and it's a really good place. Leamington is a very good town to be in. It's very very safe, very quiet. So you've got very much time to study.
Brilliant, thanks. And if we push that question to you, Jane.
Yeah, so I live off campus in Coventry City, in a neighborhood that has sort of a lot of student housing all around it, which I really enjoy. In terms of how I found it, it was honestly pretty easy. I remember I sort of put it off to the last minute, and my parents were sort of freaking out that I moved to a foreign country without housing. But I really got it within, a week, maybe 2 weeks. They had, I think it was a post-grad housing Facebook group that was open to everybody, and it just made it super easy. I have great housemates, which is ultimately why I chose that accommodation. And in terms of why I didn't do on-campus, I think it was just because my program time was kind of the awkward 12 months. So it made more sense for me to get the off-campus lease. But yeah, it was super easy.
Yeah, and I'd add to that actually when students apply to Warwick for accommodation, the deadline to apply is typically the 31st of July before the fall, so it's quite late. But when you apply, if you are in time to apply by that deadline, you can stipulate your preferences in terms of on-campus, off-campus, and there's a third option that is called partnership accommodation, which is essentially purpose-built student accommodation that is run by private providers with whom the university has an agreement. So that's really modern, all singing, all dancing, absolutely lovely accommodation that I would be very, very happy to live in, and is certainly very different to what I lived in as a student. So there's quite a few different options there. And with the off-campus accommodation that you can apply to through Warwick, that's actually where Warwick accommodation essentially subletting from private landlords, but they inspect it, they quality assure it, and so students can be assured that it's actually still very, very well maintained, and it's easy to fix any kind of issues directly with Warwick accommodation. And so then another question for Jane. Jane, you're very popular today. Sorry, Elena. Sorry, Naomi. Jane, how would you describe the research MSc to a US student? For example, is there any coursework or availability for seminars? Is it 100% research? Is it team-based research, or is it more independent?
Yeah, so in terms of how I would describe it, I really love it, honestly. It's a great opportunity. In terms of what it entails, it's really whatever you and your supervisor come up with for yourself. So I was super lucky that Joanna sort of let me be very independent. So in many ways, it was almost like doing the first and last year of a PhD at the same time, because you can sort of design your own project and see it all the way through. There's no formal coursework that I'm aware of, but I had the option to audit a lot of classes and then sort of take them for extra credit if I wanted to. And I did end up sort of taking an extra class, which was great. In terms of seminars, yes, anything that's available to any postgrads or PhD students was also fully open to me. which was really great, including all the social things actually, which was really nice. In terms of team-based versus independent, again, I think that really depends on what you and your supervisor come up with. I was very independent just because I had had a lot of experience from undergrad. But then in terms of the things that maybe I needed a bit more supervision on, there was always someone there to help me. So it was a good balance.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jane. And I think, Naomi, you might have something to add on this.
Just say the MSc or any master's by research, it can be very flexible and varies quite a lot across departments. We, for instance, at SIM are currently in the process of designing a new master's by research, which would involve like access to some taught components and workshop support and that sort of thing, as well as individual research and potentially some lab team-based work. So there is some flexibility, but yes, in essence, it's a closer step to a PhD for most, US or for UK PhD, I should say. And so in the US, it's going to feel a bit like somewhere between your second and third year as a PhD student, gaining a bit more of that independence. But as I say, dependent on the department, you might find still some of the sort of optional taught support, but also it's still normal PhD students can audit our master's classes in SIM, and that's quite common across the university. So if you were to come and do a master's by research, you would have the option, if you wish, to have the support of attending classes, but without the burden of actual coursework.
Excellent. That's really helpful. Thank you. We have another question that I think I might be best placed to answer, which is from Moira. Moira is asking if anyone could comment on issues around or difficulties that a student is having in contacting or identifying or getting specific information from an individual faculty rather than looking for that kind of generic information. I would say certainly myself, and also I think a lot of counterparts at other universities in the UK, would encourage advisors or students to reach out to myself or counterparts, because essentially we know how to navigate contacts around the university. So if a student is having difficulties connecting with a faculty member, we can hopefully help to bridge that gap, and we might be able to find an alternative person if the first person isn't available. Every time I talk to a student, I really have a bit of a preface of saying, I can give you lots of help about Warwick. Most of it will involve me signposting you to somebody, because when it comes to all of those really specific details about the programme, I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none in the best possible sense. And so typically I would work closely with my academic colleagues and network around the university to identify the right person. I know that I would do that. I'm very confident that Sian, who you met from Southampton recently, would do that. Robin from Exeter would do that. Daniel, who you'll meet next week from Manchester, would do that as well. So if you have any issues around that, definitely reach out to the recruitment representative. And if you don't know them directly, Mary knows everybody. Excellent. Are there any more questions for today? I think that's been really useful from our point of view. We're really grateful to you for asking questions, because it helps us to understand what is useful for you guys to know. But if not, then should I pass back to Mary?
To me, yeah. Thank you very much, everybody. That was really interesting and really informative as well, which I think is, the great thing about these sessions, and especially stuff about accommodation. Who knew that accommodation was going to be a hot topic for so many different sessions? So I think it's fantastic. What Sarah was saying about the people that you're meeting on all of these sessions is true, especially around Fulbright. If you do need those affiliations, especially if it's one of our partner universities, I can usually point you to the right person at the right university if you can't find out who that is, who is a Sarah equivalent or all the other people she mentioned. So I can do that occasionally, but if you ask me about certain universities that don't necessarily do that quite so easily, I may struggle a little